Hello and welcome to our next reflection on the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Yesterday we talked briefly about freedom as this great gift of God for us that makes us like God, that gives us our dignity, part of our dignity. Today we are reminded that freedom makes us moral subjects. And so when we talk about morality, we need to talk about the sources of morality. What are the things we need to take into account before passing on a moral judgment or assessing things from that viewpoint? The first one is the object chosen. The second one is the end in view, or the intention for which we choose to do something. And the third one are the circumstances within which we do the act. So what is that object? Well, the object is something outside of us. And it is the good towards which the will directs itself. So maybe we want to possess something, we want to attain something, achieve something. So whatever that object is to which we tend to. The intention is the movement of the will that directs me to attaining that object. What we need to be aware of is that the end doesn't justify the means. And so just because the end might be good, it doesn't mean I am allowed to do evil in order to attain it. That is never a good moral standpoint to take. On the other hand, my bad intention can make a good act in itself an evil one. For example, I may pray just in order to get attention. So if I were to sit in the chapel for a number of hours simply for the sake of other people seeing me that I am sitting in the chapel and praying and thinking highly of me, what a great contemplative I may be, then prayer that in itself is good, and that is so necessary for us, I have transformed this good act into an evil one for myself, simply because of my bad intention. The circumstances within which the action happens either diminish or increase my responsibility for the good or for the bad. They never transform the nature of the action. Now, there are certain acts which, apart from the intention, apart from everything else, by themselves, in and of themselves, are always gravely illicit. And so, murder, blasphemy, perjury, adultery, will be those actions that there is never an excuse for, if you could call it that. They are always evil in and of themselves, disordered actions. When we talk about our moral life, we also need to talk about the passions. That's the Church's language for our feelings, for our emotions. For those movements that incline us to act or not to act. And there are many passions in our life, as you can imagine, and I'm sure you experience on a daily basis. They are all natural components of who we are. We sense things, we look at things, and we react to them. We have plenty of desires. And so these movements are constantly at work within us. Now, Jesus names the heart as the source of all these passions. And essentially what Jesus is bringing us with his grace is the ability to become master of all that is taking place. And so to be in charge, not to be enslaved by our passions, but to use them wisely. And because all of them have the potential of leading us to the good. And for us that the good, the source of all good, is God. So, for example, one of the main fundamental passions that we would experience is love, an attraction of the good. And so that love creates a desire to attain the good that may be absent from us. And it also creates a hope of attaining it. And that desire, when it is fulfilled, it finds its completion in pleasure and in joy of possession. And that's what tends to happen to us. That's the flow, that's the movement that we all undergo. Now, in this case, it is for the good. So we seek love, we seek the things that lead us to greater love of God and our neighbor. And thereby, when we attain that, we are filled with joy, we are filled with pleasure for doing the good. So of themselves, those movements, those passions, feelings, emotions are neither good nor evil. They are meant to be governed by reason. So we are meant to make the right judgments and lead them, steer them in the right direction. So they can be there, very useful for us to lead a life of virtue. At the same time, they can be turned towards vice as well. So it's up to us, in cooperation with the Lord's grace, to steer ourselves and them in the right direction. We are the masters of them, not the other way around. And when we talk about morality, I suppose most of us would think about conscience. The Catechism reminds us that deep within conscience, we discover a law that needs obeying. A law that we haven't put there. We haven't placed it upon our shoulders by ourselves. We simply discover it. We hear this voice. We hear the judgment of conscience on our good actions, on our bad actions. And our duty is to listen to that voice of conscience. Essentially, it will always teach us and guide us to do good and to avoid evil. Hence, we feel guilty when we do particular actions, because it's the voice that reminds us this is not in accordance with God's law. And so we need to be present enough to ourselves in order to listen to that voice. And that's a great struggle for us this day and age, because in order to be attuned to this voice of conscience, we need reflection, we need self-examination, we need introspection, that ability to look deeper into what is happening within my heart, within my mind, within my soul, within my whole being, to actually discern all these movements, to be able to recognize those different passions that are at work within me. And so it demands of us serious choices in our life, to actually start and think, where is the time for me to listen to that voice of God, to discover His law that is written within every human heart. If I do that, it will allow me to take responsibility for the actions that I perform. And this voice of conscience is so sacred, that's why we say no one must be forced to act contrary to their conscience. This is sacred. We are on sacred ground here. Whatever that conscience tells you, we are asked to follow faithfully. At the same time, we are reminded that conscience needs formation. We need to form our conscience. That is actually our duty. It needs to be informed and it needs to be enlightened. And that education is a lifelong task for us. It's important because a conscience can make a right judgment, can help us arrive at a right judgment, but it can also make erroneous judgments. We can make serious mistakes. And so what leads us to those erroneous judgments? Well, primarily ignorance, Maybe we don't want to find out. We don't want to read up about things. We don't want to acquire knowledge of God's law. Or we end up as slaves of sin. If we are in a habit of sinning, we become blinded by it. And so we are no longer able even to make the right judgment. And that doesn't excuse us from bearing responsibility for those erroneous judgments. And so we bear the responsibility for living in ignorance and living in sin. The other sources of that ignorance are simply an ignorance of Christ or the gospel message. When was the last time that I read about Jesus and what his message is? When was the last time I've picked up the gospel and studied my life in relation to it? Our erroneous judgment can be helped by bad example of others. It's important to choose my friends wisely, the company I keep. I can be enslaved to passions, to my feelings, emotions, and they will rule me. And if they do, and I have no control over myself, then I will be led into wrong judgments. I can have a mistaken understanding of the autonomy of my conscience. So essentially saying, well, it's my conscience, it's my judgment, and no one else has any right to tell me anything whatsoever. Now, that's a wrong understanding of what conscience is, and it doesn't take into account the need for formation and education. We can also reject the Church's teaching and the Church's authority. I know better. No, I will not listen to the Pope. I will not pay attention to my bishop who is in union with the Pope. I know what's more important. I know what is right. And so if I place myself above the teaching of the Church or above the competent people who are my shepherds, then I can also be blinded in my judgments. And also the lack of conversion and the charity. Lack of conversion means, well, I don't want to change my life. I'm okay. There's nothing to be converted from. That's blindness. There is always something to be cleansed, to be converted from. And ultimately, the lack of charity. So, me putting myself first, rather than me serving and loving the other. So it's a complex matter. It's not a simple subject for any of us to consider. But there are some important lessons for us in this topic when we talk about morality. And essentially we need prayer, we need that deeper union with God to be tuned in to his voice within us. And so let's pray for ourselves for that intention today. God bless.